about to begin. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to ALOUD. I'm Jessica Strand, the Senior Director of Programs and Public Engagement at the Library Foundation of Los Angeles. We are in the throes of our fall season of ALOUD, the library's public-facing series, the Library Foundation's public-facing series. We still have a few programs ahead. On November 14th, Where Does Our Democracy Go From Here? A group of esteemed journalists will weigh in on this pressing question. And on November 20th, the novelist Susan Minot will be in conversation with actor, producer, writer Griffin Dunn about her new novel and his new memoir. To learn more about our season, visit lfla/alloud.org. I'd also like to mention a couple of programs going on at the Los Angeles Public Library. There's a Dias de los Muertos celebration on Saturday, November 2nd from 2 to 4 at the Central Library right here. We'll celebrate the Day of the Dead with stories, music, and art, and it will be in Spanish and English. And on Sunday, November 3rd from 2 to 4 is the Songs of the Earth. It's also here, and join us in celebrating the diversity and richness of local and worldwide indigenous languages. For those, I'm going back to the Library Foundation, for those not familiar with the Library Foundation of Los Angeles, we are a private, nonprofit organization devoted to fundraising, advocacy, and innovative programming in support of the Los Angeles Public Library. If you are not yet a member or supporter, I hope you will consider supporting the Library Foundation to continue to see programs like this one, and also to increase critical access to information, resources, and technology to help Angelinos improve their lives and fulfill their dreams. I'd also like to thank, and here's the QR code over here, just in case you get moved in the moment of seeing this and want to give the foundation. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Aaron Fox Schiff, Deloitte, the Golden Globe Foundation, Steve and Judith Krantz Foundation, the Los Angeles County Department of Arts and Culture, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Sharon Oxborough Endowed Fund for ALOUD, Peck Endowment for Cultural Programs, Ralph M. Parsons Foundation, and of course, all those individual Library Foundation donors and members here this evening. And now, for tonight's program, I'm excited to introduce the wonderful writer, André Aciman, with his new memoir, Roman Year. Aciman, with elegance and specificity, draws us into an adolescent experience, his adolescent experience, in the mid-60s in Rome. André was a teenager when he left Egypt with his mother and brother, first landing in Naples and then to Rome. Aciman's Jewish family was part of the diaspora, forced to leave during Gamal. I'm terrible with names that are not, so you can correct me after. Gamal Abdel Nasser's 2 decades in power. Roman Year takes us into Aciman's experiences, all tinged with the vulnerability and tenderness and the pain of an adolescent feeling both adrift and longing for connection, though always remaining elsewhere. As he said in an interview in the New York Times, everybody is an elsewhere person. We're always floating between the subjunctive and the conditional, the future and the past. The moments when I have lived in the present are very, very few. I think that's what writing is ultimately all about. Basically, it builds you a home that's not an elsewhere, even though it will claim to be an elsewhere, and that is the best home that exists. André Aciman is a New York Times bestselling author of Call Me by Your Name, Out of Egypt, 8 White Nights, False Papers, Alibis, Harvard Square, Enigma Variations, and Find Me. He's the editor of the Proust Project and teaches comparative literature at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Tonight, André will be in conversation with David Ulin. David is the author and editor of nearly 20 books, including Sidewalking, Coming to Terms with Los Angeles, shortlisted for the Penn Diamonstein Spiegel Award for Art of the Essay. He is the book's editor of Alta Journal and a professor of English at the University of Southern California, where he edits the literary magazine Air Light. Please welcome André Aciman and David Ulin. Thank you so much.
Hello. Give me 1 second to get some things out of my magic bag here, and then we will get started. Andre and I will be talking about his new book, Roman Year, and many other things for about 45 minutes or so, and then we will turn it over to questions from all of you. Delighted to see that there are some people not watching the game. All right, so let me start. In this book, there's so much I want to talk to you about in this book. But in this book, place is defined in some way as a matter of language, also of narrative. We can get to that in a minute. But as a matter of language as well as physical space. You know, you in writing about your Egyptian family, you talk about all of the languages that people speak and how the languages kind of blur into one another in family conversations. It becomes its own kind of vernacular. And so I wonder if we can start by talking about that idea of place being a function of language.
Well, where I come from, which is Alexandria in Egypt, there were so many languages spoken, and you automatically had to learn at least four languages, because you didn't know any of them correctly enough, but you knew how to navigate language. And so that, in essence, my mother, who was completely deaf, knew 3 languages, because you had to learn 3 languages. That's all it was. You move to a place like Italy, and there is only one language, and there is only one set of ideas, and people call palmolive for palmolive, and colgate for Colgate. And I won't tell you how they spell ultra bright, okay? Because they had to change the spelling of it entirely so that it would cohere with Italian. So you're dealing with people who come from one place where it is multi-ethnic, multi-everything, multi-sexual too, since that's what Lawrence Darrell said. And you go to a place that has one thing. It has one religion, one identity, one nationality, and that's it. And of course, you come from Egypt, where everything is plural, you feel totally lost. You feel like, who are these people? Why don't they know English? Why are the cinema always dubbed? Every film, whether it's German, American, English, or French, it's always dubbed, so that Italians, because they hate reading subtitles. When you went to Egypt, in Egypt, they had 2 languages on the subtitles. One was in Arabic, okay, and the other one was French. So that suddenly my mother, who went to the movies and liked the movies, couldn't see or understand anything because there were no subtitles and everybody spoke. So you're dealing with a sense of already being removed from the immediacy of a place because you don't have the language. I knew Italian just about enough to get along. But you move to a place like Rome, where people are speaking in the Roman dialect, which is, it's not difficult to understand once you get used to it. But initially, I couldn't understand a word. So people spoke to me, and I didn't understand what they said. My mother, of course, didn't understand anything. And my brother just managed to make friends who were Italian. So I was the one who was not really moving along. I was rejecting Italy, probably because I didn't like it, probably because I had an uncle who received us, and essentially it was so horrible that he made me hate him, and I hated Italy, and I wanted out.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about Egypt being, let's say, open. It is also the case that you and your family were forced to leave. So it was open linguistically, and or had a history of openness linguistically and culturally. But at the time that you were growing up, it was very constricted as well, or even worse.
Well, it was not as constricted as the years moved on. So that when I went back to Egypt, because I had written out of Egypt, And so they said, the New York Times wants to do a piece about you're returning to Egypt. Fine, I went back to Egypt, and guess what? There was one language. It was only Arabic. People didn't know French anymore. Nobody spoke French, which was the dominant language of everybody. You had to, even if you didn't know French, you had to mimic it and pretended that, and you understood half of it anyway. So the only two persons that I saw in Alexandria walking the street, it was a very old couple. They were Greek and they knew French, but otherwise nobody else knew French. So while I was growing up and into my early teenage years, yes, you could still speak French, you could still speak Italian and Greek naturally, but as the years moved on, it became more and more Egyptian and Arabic was a dominant language. And that became sort of, for a European kid, who was not really European because I was born Turkish,
Right.
okay? So that's not European, okay? But I thought I was French, okay? So I was totally mistaken about even my identity.
I mean, I'm glad you brought up Out of Egypt. I don't want to make the mistake of calling this book a sequel to Out of Egypt. I think of it more as a kind of a companion volume. And I also think of the three books. I think of Out of Egypt, False Papers, and this as kind of following a sort of a line in terms of you know, place, language, literature, identity. And I wonder if you can talk about the challenges and or the pleasures of kind of returning to this territory.
Well, you return to it, well, you didn't say the key word, you return to it as a writer.
Yes, as a writer.
Okay,
Yes.
You're always returning as a writer, which means that the person you are on a daily basis, and I love saying this, is, you know, I have a family, I have sons, I have a wife, I have a job, I live in New York, blah, 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 okay? These are all facts. But the real me, or the other me, is the writer. The person who essentially goes deep into himself and tries to remember and bring out a narrative that is cohesive enough so that it makes sense to somebody who doesn't understand anything about what I'm trying to say. So I have to make certain that my writing is, in fact, reflecting and identifying with something far more profound about me than simply the man who has a family, has a job, has a religion, has et cetera, et cetera. So I enjoy going into that little hovel of mine, which is the hovel inside of me, which is a place where I can be very, very private. I can investigate, I can excavate whatever I want, I can interpret what I excavate, I can decide not to publish it or to put it aside or throw it and crumple it away. But in essence, I love going into myself because all the stories that I tell are not the stories as they happened, but as I recollect them.
And it's also, we were talking before, I hate to bring up an offstage conversation, but we were talking before about the idea of discovering those stories through the act of writing,
Yes.
not having those stories in front of you and deciding to write them, but the action of writing as an action
Yes.
is the driver. And I wonder if we can talk a little bit about that.
Well, essentially, when I'm writing, I'm remembering. I don't remember many things, but once I start writing, I put them together. I say, oh yes, this happened and that happened. And I've got to call my brother because he's the only one, after my parents died, he's the only one I can basically identify with or who can corroborate what I remember. So I'll call him and I'll say, do you remember what so-and-so said when blah, 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 this and that happened? No. Do you care to remember? Not at all. Because that is it's another kind of identifying sort of person who does not want to dwell in the past or on the past. He wants to be in the present. He has a job, he likes what he does, etc. I am sort of escaping the present in order to go into a different dimension. This could have happened, this might have happened, this should have been said, and it never was said. Why wasn't it said? And it's the optative or the conditional or the subjunctive that I really feel is my home, because that's where I excel. In the present tense, that's my brother's domain. I can't compete with that.
I think it's really interesting that you bring up I once had a conversation, I once wrote an essay about something my brother and I did together, and he called me and said, that's exactly how I remember it, and I said, then I got it wrong. Right? Or the two of us had at some point discussed it and kind of conflated a version that was our shared version. So I want to ask you about the subjectivity of that process, the writing process, the subjectivity of the memory process. Not even just sort of the act of remembering as opposed to the act of being in the present, but if your brother were engaging in the act of remembering, it would necessarily be an utterly different remembering that he would be doing.
Yes, but he doesn't care for it.
Right.
That's the whole point, is that, yes, if he had a version A,
right.
and I had version B, I would have to include his.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to remember that in the end of Out of Egypt, one of the editors said to me, as we were editing Out of Egypt, my first book written 30 years ago, she said to me, there are too many kids in this book. You have to get rid of a kid. I said, well, I can't get rid of myself because there's no story. Well, then get rid of your brother. Okay, all right. So I got rid of my brother. But the point is that I had already published an essay where he and I are walking down a street to buy a particular, or to say goodbye to the city. So I had to pretend that I had forgotten that I had written that essay. But then when I went back to Egypt, one of the things I wanted to do was to walk that street again and essentially find out for myself what had happened. And this is the irony of the whole situation, is that I couldn't remember if I had gone with my brother, if I had gone alone, if I had not gone at all on that street. But I had written that I had gone, and therefore the writing of having said so basically overwrote everything else. And I wrote an essay about that because I was no longer certain of anything, which is not unfamiliar if you read my books. Everybody in my books is uncertain about everything. And so...
That's interesting. I like that idea. I mean, you have a moment late in Roman year where you, sort of the contemporary version of you and your family goes back in a similar kind of way. Goes back and walks the street and goes to the apartment and all of that. Was that similar? You know, the experience of that. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the experience of going back and how similar or different it was.
Here's the problem. How many of you have gone back looking for something? Oh, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. You go back hoping to retrieve something. And of course you tell all your friends, you know, I went back to this particular high school or the grade school where we went, and I had this amazing epiphany, and I felt as if I was walking and said, no, it doesn't work that way. I went back to Egypt. I went back to Rome with my family, hoping that my family would help me understand what it is that I was looking for with them. And I felt nothing. I wrote an essay. I was interviewed for a newspaper in Rome about 3 years ago about going back to that particular apartment that we had in Rome, which is in the book. And he said, how did you feel going back to the place? Oh, it was very illuminating. I was very moved. I felt absolutely nothing. But that is what happens when you go back to a place hoping to retrieve something. You retrieve nothing at all. But you have to be honest with yourself and say, you know, this was a wasted trip. I could have gone to this museum instead.
Right. But there is something that happens. So I do, you know, in the writing, I mean, there's a lot that I mean, these are questions that this book addresses from the point of view of the first person protagonist, right? And yet there is a lot of memory, there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of self-reflection in terms of what those memories or what those stories mean. So I'm really interested in this conundrum or this contradiction, because I feel it too as a writer, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how that meaning develops in the face of, because I agree with you, I go back and the place seems smaller and more tawdry than it was, and the thing I thought was so great is, you know, it's barely noticeable, and what, you know. So what is that act of the the imaginative transformation of the
Well,
experience?
the real experience,
Yeah.
the real experience is always very deceptive. It's disappointing. You don't get what you wanted. I know that when I go back to a place that I happen to have loved in the past, called Lowell House. I don't know how many of you know Lowell House, but it is a wonderful place. And suddenly I go back there, and it's a small courtyard. I thought it was a huge courtyard where we used to sun in the wonderful days of early spring. Nothing. It was just but that's all real.
Right.
What happens is when you write about it, it becomes something totally different. You're writing because you want to retrieve something. And the act of writing allows you, even when you're honest enough to say you felt nothing, the feeling nothing is itself a way of feeling something.
Mm-hmm. This might be a good place to read the passage that we were talking about.
This is about writing. I hope you're interested in that. Well, I think I'm remembering wrong.
I think it was 346 or 7.
347. Yes. Sorry, I got to do this and I got to do that. Okay, writing about the experience of walking back with my family, as I did later that day, would surely unnumb me. Writing would dust off things that were not there at the time of my visit, or that were there but that I wasn't quite seeing and needed time and paper to sort out, so that once written about, they'd confer on my visit the retrospective resonance that part of me had hoped to find on the street itself. This is walking down the street with my family, where I had lived. Writing might even bring me closer to the street than I'd been while I lived here. Writing wouldn't alter much or exaggerate anything. It would simply excavate, rearrange, lace a narrative, recollect in tranquility, where ordinarily life is perfectly happy to nod and move on. Writing sees figures where life sees things. Things we leave behind, though. Figures we keep. Even the experience of numbness, when traced on paper, acquires a disenchanted grace, a melancholy cadence that seems at once intimate and aroused compared to the original blah. Writing about numbness, and numbness turns into something. Upset flat surfaces dig out their shadows, and you've got dream making. And I totally believe this. So,
your brother throughout the book, the character of your brother
Yes.
throughout the book, is always chiding the narrator for romanticizing things.
yes.
And which he does. But I wonder, I wonder the extent to which that romanticizing is a function of nostalgia or the desire for nostalgia. Because the book, not just this book, but the memoir, the nonfiction work often sort of reaches for nostalgia, but also rejects it a little bit.
Well, nostalgia is an easy thing, and people assume I'm a nostalgist, but I'm not. I'm trying to sort of step into the real world, and I'm failing every time. So, but my brother was always calling me and saying, "You're romanticizing." What he meant is, you're going for the lyrical. You're not seeing things as they in themselves are, to quote Matthew Arnold. And he was always chiding me, as you said, because he doesn't want to escape from the real. He likes the real, or that's what he wants to see. I want to see something other, and I'm always after something other, not the real details of real life. And so as I'm writing, and I'm writing about, for example, I can talk about for infinity, about the radiators in our apartment that never worked, okay? The radiators, but basically I'm trying to see the radiator for what they are, and I can't because I'm trying to understand what is going on behind the radiator. What is the radiator doing? Who are the people who come to fix the radiator and do not attempt to fix it at all because they can't? There's something about radiators which are real, and at the same time, I'm looking for something else besides the radiator. I'm looking for warmth. I'm looking for something that speaks to me and that is not just a radiator.
It's also, I'm curious about, you're writing about yourself, that's one thing. You're writing about your family. You're, again, in Out of Egypt here, in
Yeah.
the essays. And you're writing about them in a fairly blunt way, we might say.
Honest.
In an honest way. So I'm curious about sort of, let's say the questions, the challenges of memoir, the responsibilities of memoir, when you're working on a piece about family or people in your life. How are you positioning that piece? I mean, how much are you revealing, and how are you're betraying them to some extent, but you're also very gentle as well, and I'm just curious about that too.
It's what I call, you take their pants down,
Yeah.
and then you help them lift them up. You lift up the pants, and you get them dressed again because it's ridiculous, okay?
Right.
So the job of an author is also to undress people. And my uncle Claude, who came to pick us up in Naples, I mean, he didn't have to do that. He put us through a school, and he had to interview the director, and he had to befriend him and pretend that he liked the director, when in fact he couldn't be bothered. He was a rich man. He had his own life, etc. What am I doing with him? Well, he got me to hate Italy. That's how it is, because he was so awful and he's so mean to me in the first chapter that I said, I'm going to spit on his grave when he dies. And the reason why I haven't done that is because I still don't know where he's buried.
Right, which you also say in the memoir. And in fact, the book begins, the first sentence of the book, I feel we should read is, "And please don't hate me, I'm no ogre," said my great-uncle Claude as he was about to walk out of our new apartment in Rome and head toward the stairway. I mean, that, and then as you say later in that chapter, for someone to say, "Don't hate me, I'm no ogre," is pretty much a dead giveaway.
Yes. No, he's hateable. He's totally disliked. So eventually, but he's so mean. He's mean to me. He's especially mean to my brother. He's mean to my mother, who's deaf. And he says, couldn't they have taught you to speak at least? Come on, that's not a thing to say to somebody who's deaf. And he does awful things. So at some point, my mother had cooked artichokes. Yeah. And she said, would you please taste one? I don't want to taste your stupid artichokes. She said, just taste it and see if they're good enough. So he tastes it. Fine, I'll taste an artichoke. And then he starts weeping because the artichokes remind him of how his mother used to cook artichokes. And he starts weeping, and then he doesn't just weep, he sobs. And suddenly I'm making fun of him because his voice is high-pitched as he's crying. And he sounds like a woman, he's not, there's something very awful about him. Everything is wrong, and you start seeing that. And he says that to my mother, you know what? You are a real lady. And of course he doesn't mean it, but somehow I've just putting back his pants on after having taken them down and hating him.
But then, of course, he forces her to prepare artichokes for him for basically a token payment, right?
Yeah. She has to cook artichokes. I need those artichokes every week. And so he needs 12 of them, which basically means that you have to ruin your hands because you have to throw out the bracts, or the bracts, or whatever they're called, the leaves, so that you can cook the heart of the artichoke. And that was for her, basically it ruins her hands. For a whole week, she has no hands that she can sort of be smooth, so she has to put cream and lemon and all sorts of things on her hands. But at the same time, he's also nice because he takes us to a meeting of the whole family, which he arranges so that they can discuss what it is that I'm supposed to become. Should I go to an Italian grade school because I'm an adolescent, I'm a senior in high school, and I'm going to be in grade school to learn Italian, or am I going to be going to an English school, or should I go to a French school, or should I go to America as I wanted to? And at that meeting, it turns out that they decide that I should go to an English school. I don't want to go to an English school. By then, I had already gone to an American school in Egypt, and I didn't want to go to an English school. Lo and behold, he had already made an appointment with the headmaster of the English school while he was advocating for us to go to an Italian grade school. So he basically is doing everything right, but for the wrong reasons.
Right. And you know, not to reduce him or to strip away the fact that he was an actual living human being, but that makes him a much more compelling and complicated character.
He is complicated. He's very complicated. I'm still going to spit on his grave if I can.
So, I mean, for me, the question is, you know, in terms of writing memoir, you're exposing people in your family, you're exposing people in your life, so you have to be willing to expose yourself as well, which you do in the memoir in a variety of ways. And I'm curious about that notion of revisiting from the vantage point of adulthood yourself as an adolescent. And there is both proximity and distance there. We are very close to that 16, 17-year-old boy, but at the same time, there are passages where you, as the writer, kind of pull back and address, you know, comment on decisions he's made or things he's doing or whatever. So I'm curious about that balance in the writing.
Well, let's go to two subjects. Okay. One is I am reading all the time because that's my way of, first of all, of alienating Rome, of not being part of Rome, of staying away from the present day and going back to 19th century Russia, for example.
It's an act of resistance in a certain sense.
It is. It's my way of saying, no, right. I don't want to be here. On the other hand, here I am reading all the time. Half the time, I have the shutters of the windows closed so that I can stay in the dark. There's enough light for me to read, and I don't have to look outside. The other hand is, what am I thinking about besides the books? There is only one thing I'm thinking about, and I'm sure you all guessed what it is. All I'm thinking about is sex, okay? This is all that I'm thinking about. So any opportunity for more thinking, or actually finally something, is better than nothing. I don't care who it is with. I don't even think that far. But in essence, those are the two things that I've occupied my time when I was 16 and 17. But then, you know, there is also the writer me, the man who is remembering all these things. And I'm supposed to be a 70-year-old person remembering what the feelings were of a young adolescent. They haven't changed. I haven't changed. I'm still thinking about it the same way. I think about the books the same way and about sex the same way. If I told you the number of times that I think about sex, it's embarrassing. But of course, you are not prone to that. I know. Okay. Thank God you're laughing because it means that.
There's a line here, you know, where your mother tells you a story and says, "Promise not to tell anyone," right? And of course you immediately tell everyone. Yeah. And not only do you tell everyone, you tell your mother tells everyone also.
She tells everybody.
And she tells the, you know, I know she's not, it's a wrong word for her, but she essentially tells the neighborhood yenta who tells everybody, yes. Right? That seemed to me, and then it's in the book as well. Now it's in the book. Yeah. So it's this broader range of people. It seemed to me that was almost a perfect metaphor for the act of memoir or personal nonfiction writing. It's the sense that you're privy to all of these things that people are saying. It reminds me of, in some way, the beginning of Maxine Hahn Kingston's The Woman Warrior, is her mother saying, "You must never tell anyone." That's the first line of the book, and then the whole book is her telling. So so there's something really interesting to me about that notion of encoding the warning. Don't tell anyone. This can't get out. And now here it is. You know.
Well, this is the story of the woman whose daughter is pregnant.
Yes.
And she's gotten pregnant with the very man who gambles with her father and beats him at gambling every single time.
Right.
And
she's betrothed to someone else.
And she's getting married to somebody else who has the same name as the father. Okay, so essentially it's a mess. Why do I out this? How could you not? You know, I mean, it's lovely. But I've been the same way about my parents. My father was philandering and cheating on his wife all the time. My mother was complaining, and my mother was deaf. She was shouting a lot. Um, I couldn't hide this. I mean, yeah, I could have smoothed it down. I could have sort of sandpapered the whole thing so that you wouldn't even know. Or he had one failing once in a while. No, that's not how it happened. It happened that he was consistently cheating on her, and I had to. That's part of the truth. That's you don't sort of withhold information when it's that interesting, or at least that piquant for you.
And that important, I think. You know, I mean, it's essential to the dynamic. With father, certainly, it's essential to the dynamic of the family. It makes the relationship between the narrator and the father, which is a really loving relationship in a lot of ways, although he certainly sees his father for who he is. It makes it so much deeper and more resonant.
It does, and in fact, to pick up what you were saying, my mother was complaining that my father cheated on her all the time. Mm-hmm. She hated it, and I said, you know, you're right, Mom, absolutely. And then my father would say, you know, your mother's impossible to live with. I said, yeah, you're right, Dad. And how can I both be right? And that's the problem. My brother would never say that two persons were right, even though they are contending with each other. I can. And because that is part of who I am, I can see all sides all the time, and that means that I am arrested and cannot decide anything. Whereas my brother is a man who makes decisions.
And remarkably, I mean, that's your father too in this book. He,
yes.
you know, they use the phrase roundtabling things. He will continually belabor the deliberation so he doesn't have to make a decision.
Yeah. He doesn't want to make decisions, and he's putting off making decisions, and I make fun of it because we called it round tabling. In other words, you sit around a round table and you discuss things, and it seems that you're getting somewhere, and then you decide, well, let's not decide today, we'll revisit this tomorrow.
Right.
And that's what we did all the time. And when it came time for him to die, my father, this is not in the book, but I told him, you have cancer, it's not good, it won't get any better. You have to decide whether you want medication, you want to be treating it, or you don't want to treat it. And I said, typical of me, I'll ask you the same question tomorrow, and I'll ask it again on the day after. In other words, I was round-tabling too.
Now, you said in the past, and we were talking about this before as well, that you know you've addressed this question of the difference between fiction and nonfiction, or the lack of a difference between nonfiction and fiction. You've written, you know, you've written many books of fiction and many books of nonfiction. I'd love to talk about the kind of the relationship in general, and also in your own writing, between fiction and nonfiction.
Well, I'm writing a memoir, and the reason why I write memoirs, and I like writing memoirs because essentially I'm very bad at plot. And the advantage of a memoir is that it gives you the plot. It comes from your life, okay? So you can't cheat that. I didn't live in South America, I lived in Rome. Okay, so I cannot change that. But when you're writing about your past, you have to come up with some kind of narrative. And so you don't alter the facts. I don't know if that's the question you're asking.
No, this is definitely part of the question.
You don't alter the facts, but you sort of enter into them. You, as I like to say, you excavate the facts. Mm-hmm. So that you are fundamentally not just telling a story, you're interpreting the story, which is different. And that's something that I know how to do, is to interpret as opposed to just tell the story. And to come back to the issue that you raised, which is what's the difference between a memoir and a work of fiction? In my case, they're very similar because I write about my life as if it belonged in a novel. In other words, I don't make things up, but I write about them as if you're reading a novel. And I think that's true of Out of Egypt, it's true of my essays, and it's true of Romanier. That, in other words, you don't necessarily feel that you're reading a book of nonfiction. You're reading nonfiction as if it were fiction.
Does that idea of interpreting a story, I think that's really interesting. Does that grow out, you think, of your training, your academic training?
Maybe, but I don't know that it does, because I like to interpret. I like to interpret people.
Mm-hmm.
I like to understand what motives people have when they're doing something, or when they're pretending that they adore me or my writing or whatever. I want to know, well, what's behind this, okay? I'm always asking that. So I'm constantly interpreting. So when a character shows up and does something like cry when eating an artichoke, I want to understand what's that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to just tell you he was crying. I want to understand what it is that he saw in the food that allowed him to break down.
Yeah, that's a great point, I think. But I do want to sort of push back on you about plot, because you've written wonderful fiction, and that is, as fiction must go, I guess as naturalistic fiction must be, plot-driven. So you are, so there is that that development of non-autobiographical plot.
Yeah, but I don't like plot, and I always say that. I'm bad at plot. I'd much rather interpret somebody staring at somebody who's making a piece of who's building a violin,
Mm-hmm.
and what are his motives, and what is it that the person looking at the person building a violin doing while he's watching him doing that. I'm much more interested in that than actually the person with the violin finally played the violin and he
Right.
sounded like Stradivarius,
Yeah.
I'm not going to do that.
Right. No, I agree with you. I think in a lot of cases, plot is sort of the scaffolding on
Yeah.
which the really interesting stuff in a novel is
Oh,
hung.
well put, well put. Yeah.
So, but when and I know this comes back to this question of sort of just the writing as an act of discovery. But for instance, when you're writing a novel, when you're writing Call Me by Your Name, what's the impetus to tell that fictional story as opposed to simply telling an autobiographical story, or writing an essay or another memoir?
What's the point of writing a novel like that? Because I think it has to be fiction.
Right.
But if you notice in Call Me by Your Name, there's very little action.
Yeah.
It's all about Elio looking at Oliver and trying to understand what Oliver is about.
Yeah.
Is he really a meanie, or is he just indifferent to him? Or could he be brought to like him maybe a tiny bit?
Mm-hmm.
He's constantly ruminating these things, which is, I think, the beauty of the film itself, just
Yeah.
to go there. How many of you have seen the film? Okay, Jesus Christ. If you saw the film, you would notice that most of the interpretative machine that Elio brings on the scene is absent. But he's constantly staring.
Mm-hmm.
And in the stare that he gives, you can already divine what is going on in his head. You cannot have a voiceover saying, and suddenly I saw that he was blah, blah, blah. That's not going to happen. But he is constantly interpreting. And I love that.
Yeah.
I didn't, the novel is graphic too, I have to say. It is graphic, and it has that peach scene, which I don't know what made me write that.
No, I've had that experience as well. Sometimes I have I don't know where that came from.
Yeah.
I'm glad it showed up, but I don't know where it came from.
I was going to remove it, and my editor says, absolutely not. I said, come on, it's embarrassing. Anyway.
So a couple more questions, then we'll turn it over to the audience. For me, one of the fascinating things about Rome, which you touch on in the memoir, is the fact that it's so built upon itself, right? You'll have
Yeah.
a door from the 1st century in a building that was then added onto in 1400, and now people are living in it as well. I know Alexandria has a different version of that kind of deep history. You've lived in New York for a long time. A large part of this book is about the sort of the narrator's longing to go to New York. I mean, for an American city, New York, or for a U.S. city, I suppose, New York has its layering of history as well. But I'm curious about the kind of the role that sort of the, let's say, the presence, the residue of history, or the used residue of history in each of these cities has for you.
Well, I'll speak about Rome in particular because when I was in Italy, my uncle, the mean one, that I'm going to spit on his grave, he wrote to us and said, by the way, there's on Via Enea, there's this and that. On Via Turno, there's that. On Via Eurialo, there's that. Now, if you know anything about Italian cities, you know that these are all characters coming from Virgil. So I said, oh my God, Enea is Aeneas.
Right.
And God, I'm going to live on the near, and Via Clelia. Clelia was not in the Aeneid, but she was somebody else. And then there's Via Eurialo and Turno. These are all characters from Virgil. And I was thrilled that I was going to live near those streets. But I didn't realize that when I arrived to Rome, those streets were marketplaces. They were poor places that basically people worked all day long in those apartments. It was a working class neighborhood. And so, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I didn't belong there. I didn't feel I belonged there. Of course I belonged there because I had no money. But the problem is that that street, those names, suggested something that was totally not founded. Rome, however, and when you go in, there's ancient Rome, which is still there,
Yeah.
and there's Renaissance Rome, there's medieval Rome, there's Baroque Rome, and there's 17th and 18th and 19th, and there's also Fellini's Rome, and there's Paolo Sorrentino's Rome as well. These are wonderful, it's a whole thing. And Freud's essay on Rome is fabulous, because he writes about Rome as sort of multi-layered, a multi-layered city. And he says that the ruins you see are not just ruins, they're ruins of subsequent ruins. In other words, you don't only see the ruins of Rome, but you see the ruins on top of those ruins that are themselves ruins. So you have an infinity of time trapped in that city. Most people in Rome don't care about that. They don't see it, because when you live in Rome, you don't see that. You basically, yes, you see an archway, you see an old aqueduct, you have to walk around it, or by car you have to drive around it.
Or
and
you're mapping out how many buses you have to take to get to school on time.
oh yeah, God, I have to take 4 buses to get to school. That was horrible. So it was a city that I didn't identify with once you removed the patina of, you know, ancient glory and the glorious Rome of the ancient poets. And eventually I just stopped seeing it. But I fell in love with the Rome of my bookstores, because I was walking. This is how I discovered Rome. From bookstore to bookstore to bookstore, I would basically eventually get to know a Rome that belonged to me. It was my Rome.
Right. Then that's what I wanted to, I think that's the last question I want to ask, is about that idea that, because I think one of the fascinating things about the memoir is that even as the narrator is resisting Rome, he's falling in love with Rome, and we're seeing it, even though he doesn't quite know it yet. And that tension, I think, is really, really powerful. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Eventually, basically, one day, and ironically, we took pictures of ourselves on that day. We all went to the Spanish Steps. It's a Palm Sunday. It's a beautiful day. If you know Rome, you know that on Palm Sunday, the whole Spanish Steps are filled with pots of flowers, so that you have to negotiate your steps as you walk up and down the steps. It's lovely. It's absolutely lovely. And I realized at that moment that I'm falling in love with this city. And it reminds me, Jesus, I wish it didn't, but it does remind me of Alexandria. Except there is no water, because on a day like today, I'd want to swim. And I love the Mediterranean for that reason. So the next week, I buy a copy of Justine by Lawrence Durrell, and the Palm Sunday's over, but the Spanish Steps are still there. I happen to have a bicycle that day, and I take the bicycle, I go to the bookstore, I buy the book, and I start reading about Alexandria on the Spanish Steps of Rome. And of course, Lawrence Darrell didn't really portray Alexandria. It was not my Alexandria at all. But it allowed me to at least connect with something that was in me and that wasn't necessarily just in me, it was also in the book. And that made a huge difference for me.
And that's the narrator's own kind of personal layering of ruin upon ruin, in a certain sense. This has been a great conversation. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's turn it over to all of you. If there, well, we can applaud. And there's either raise your hand and we'll have a microphone come around. So anyone, any questions?
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My name is Michael. I'm actually writing a chapter of my dissertation on Out of Egypt.
Oh.
Incredible modernist memoir, and I was hoping to ask what you envision your relationship to literary modernism to be, because there's so much of Proust in your work, and in that book in particular. How do you see yourself fitting in with that tradition of the high modernist canon?
Of the high?
Modernist canon, or not fitting in, as it may be.
It depends what modernist canon you're talking about. If you're talking about Joyce and Proust, that's one canon, and I happen to adore it. I don't read much fiction that's, I mean, I do continue to read fiction, but I'm not a big fan of contemporary fiction. Partly because an author for me has to be dead before I read it. I'm just being flippant. No, it's more that if you're talking about Proust, then I can talk to you. And if you're talking about James Joyce, who wrote about Dublin all his life while he was not living in Dublin at all, which is one of the big contradictions. In fact, he wrote The Dead in Rome. Of all the things that you can write about in Rome, he wrote The Dead, which is a fabulous, probably the best short story in existence in English. But I don't know what your question is.
Proust in particular, though.
Well, Proust influenced me a great deal because I've read Proust, I've taught Proust to graduate students a lot, many times, and I happen to believe that we are a product of the past. The past inhabits us. It is there if you care to find it and retrieve it if you can. At the same time, the past is worthless if you don't have the style to enter it. You just cannot be Hemingway and write about the past. It won't work. You have to have that kind of willpower, that sustainability that Proust has to write long sentences in order to arrive at that miracle of discovery, which he's constantly having, except it comes as I believe, at the very end of a sentence, so that you have to reread the sentence again in order to enjoy coming to the end. And you may stay there for the rest of your life, okay?
Other hands? There in front.
I could talk loud.
Oh, wait, we'll get a microphone to you.
Thank you so much. I'm curious, what influenced your decision to pursue a career in education?
I had a career in brokerage, in financial brokerage, and I was terrible at it. Partly because the companies I worked for were constantly going out of business. But if they were in business, I was not going to last very long. Then I moved to advertising, and I thought I was cut out for that, but it was extremely boring, and they fired me. So I said, okay, now I have to look for something. And my wife said, you started your dissertation, why don't you finish it? I said, nobody wants my dissertation. She said, yeah, but it's only a question of 6, 7 months, and you can do it. And I did it in that month. And of course, once I had done that, I realized that I am a good teacher. And I love teaching, and I love reaching out to people, and not only finding out what they think of me, but also what they think themselves. And it is a wonderful career to be involved in. I love it, I have to say. But of course, just to add something that you didn't ask about, I do know that when I teach literary theory, as complicated as literary theory is, and the graduate students are all listening to me, I know what they're thinking. He is the guy who wrote this speech scene. But I do love teaching.
More other questions?
Oh, somebody raised his
Yeah,
hand.
here comes the, wait for the microphone.
Okay, I'm so nervous. But anyway, why did you decide to write this book now? Like, what was the
Okay.
impetus, or like, why did you feel like this was the right time to do it?
I had written many, many essays about Rome. It's amazing the number of essays that I wrote about Rome, about living in Rome, about missing Rome, about this and that about Rome. And I realized one thing, though, that I had avoided doing throughout, is that I never said that we were extremely poor in Rome. And I felt that probably I was avoiding the subject because I was embarrassed. Or maybe I felt I should be embarrassed of poverty. And so eventually I decided I'm going to make a clean break and tell my whole story, my whole vision of Rome as I lived it, and not as I think people wanted to hear me talk about Rome. I don't mention the Vatican at all, I think. I mention the Colosseum only once when I see it for the first time, and that's it. Because I'm beset by the thought that we're living in a rather impoverished neighborhood. And this does not sit well with me, but I have no choice. We are poor. And so I try to describe the poverty on the streets of Via Clelia, which is the original title of the book, was going to be Via Clelia.
We have one more, so this will be the last question. One second, wait for the microphone.
Hi.
Hello.
I noticed you talk about how a lot of your characters are uncertain, and I'm 18 and very uncertain. I was wondering if you have any book recommendations that I should read to become more certain.
Oh, listen, if I discovered it, you think I would be here talking about uncertainty? I'd be writing a book about being certain about things. No, but if you read my book, Homo Irrealis, which is about the irrealis mood, which is basically the subjunctive, the conditional, the optative, all those moods that have nothing to do with the present because they didn't even occur. That's where I live, and that's where my uncertainty all sort of grows out of, because I don't like the present. I like the past, I like the future anterior, I like the conditional. I don't like the present. So you're talking to the wrong person.
And on that note, thank you very much, André Aciman.
Thank you so much, all.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you both. And André Aciman's books will be sold. They're signed already in the lobby. And thank you both very much. Thank you. I hope to all see you on the 14th of November. Take care.